Good evening, everyone, and thanks for tuning in tonight for an important discussion about an important topic, voting. It's currently election season. Early voting for the August 6th primary is underway, and we're just a little over 3 months away from the general election on November 3rd. And all of this is happening during a pandemic and as cases of the virus continue to increase across the state and here in District 82. Nonetheless, it's imperative that Tennesseans vote. The late, great Congressman John Lewis once said, "Your vote matters." If it didn't, why would some people keep trying to take it away? This is so true, especially here in Tennessee, where we've seen it become increasingly difficult to vote over the last decade. I'm so excited to be joined tonight by Lisa Quigley. Lisa serves as Chief of Staff for Congressman Jim Cooper, who represents the 5th Congressional District in Middle Tennessee. A 25-year veteran of Capitol Hill, Lisa has worked with members of Congress under 5 presidents. She is likely one of the most knowledgeable people in the state when it comes to voting and elections in Tennessee, especially as it relates to voter registration, participation, suppression, and intimidation. Lisa, thank you so much for being here tonight. I look forward to your presentation and learning more about the barriers to voting in Tennessee and what we can do to make it easier for Tennesseans to participate in democracy. Lisa, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It is indeed my honor to be speaking with you tonight. I'm so excited about watching what you've been doing in your campaign, and surely you're going to inspire a lot of people to get out to vote. And tonight what we wanted to talk about, though, is that voting's not so easy in Tennessee. And so I thought I would go through the slides, and it will take about 15, 20 minutes max. Okay. And then I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Okay, first slide. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So after 2014 in Tennessee, we knew we had a crisis. Tennessee was 50th in voter turnout, just ahead of Texas. And this was not always the case in Tennessee. Next slide. And we wondered, well, maybe this was just a one-time thing. But then in 2016, we were 48th in participation. And in 2018, we were a little better at 44th, but still we used to be in the 30s. And this was something we were very concerned about. Slide. And there was a study done at Northern Illinois University that really struck me, that came out about a year ago. And it measured how easy it is to vote in all of the states. And it turns out that Tennessee has fallen from the 10th easiest state to vote in to the 3rd hardest state to vote in, from the 10th position in 1996 to the 48th position in 2016. Next slide. The last decade has really been devastating for voting rights in Tennessee, and it's really attributed to 2 things. One, there have been new laws to restrict the vote in Tennessee, and 2, there's been no progress made on common voting best practices and use of technology. These are common things that are used in other states that we have not used here. So I just want to set up the political dynamic just to understand, because we're going to start talking about the Secretary of State. And I wanted just to point out that we're the only state in the union that has 3 statewide elected officials. Our governor and our 2 senators are our only statewide elected officials. Some states have a lot more statewide elected officials. We only have 3. Our legislature is overwhelmingly Republican. And our Secretary of State, who's responsible for administering our elections, is not appointed by the governor, nor is he elected by the voters. In a very strange situation we have in Tennessee, the Secretary of State is appointed by the Republican legislature. And so what that means is that all 95 of our election commissions are controlled by Republicans. Now, that does not mean that all of our election commissions are working hard to make sure that people don't vote or only vote for Republicans. It just means that people are sometimes confused in, like, say, Shelby County or in Davidson County, because they think of them as being blue counties, but their election commissions are controlled by Republicans. Next slide. So here's a map, actually, that shows if you're darker green, you're a state where it's pretty easy to vote. And then you go to the other end of the chart and you see that we're very light, pale green, almost white. We're a very difficult state in which to vote. Next slide. So let me tell you why some of the things that we have make it difficult for us to vote. We have a 30-day voter registration deadline in Tennessee. There's only a handful of states that have that threshold. This used to be a common practice because all of the voter data was stored manually in file cabinets. But we don't do that anymore. It's stored digitally. So we shouldn't have to have a 30-day voter registration deadline. Some states don't have a voter registration deadline at all. And the ACLU says it's the single most important thing that we could do in Tennessee to either eliminate the 30-day voter registration or to decrease that from 30 days to, say, 15 days, or better yet, to 0 days. And the reason this is a problem is because most voters start paying attention to elections when the advertising begins, and that's usually within the 30-day threshold. And then new arrivals to the state within that 30 days, they don't have a chance at all. They're completely disenfranchised. And up until September of 2017, we couldn't even register to vote online. That was very old technology, decades old in some states, but we weren't using it here until just 3 years ago. Next slide. We also have strict photo ID requirements. We have a very narrow definition of a government-issued photo ID. And remember, poor people don't drive. They don't have the most common form of ID, which is the driver's license. You could use a passport, but only 28% of Tennesseans have passports. You can get an ID for voting purposes at the driver's service center, but you have to tell them, I'm too poor to get a driver's license. I would like to get an ID to vote. And most workers aren't trained to understand how to respond to that. College students cannot use their state college or university ID, even though the faculty and the staff can. The kids aren't trusted, the adults apparently are. And in Tennessee, you're fine to vote and show your ID if it's a handgun permit, which I find particularly distressing. College students are truly screwed in the voting process in Tennessee. For example, if you go to college and you ask for an absentee ballot, you might get one. But every time there's an election, you have to ask for one every single time. In most states, once you ask for an absentee ballot, then you keep getting one from every election. You don't even have to think about it anymore. Also, ballots have to go to your college address, maybe to a dorm or to an apartment building. Parents aren't allowed to have the ballot received at their home and then forwarded on to their college-age students. Also, we don't have drop boxes for ballots. So if you get a ballot late, like I fear will happen this election, you can't drop it off at the polling place. Many states have drop boxes. We do not. They have to be sent via United States Postal Service or overnight mail. You must show an ID from the state of Tennessee. And unless you're registered in person, meaning that someone at the Election Commission saw your ID, you can't even request an absentee ballot because the law of this state says you have to vote the first time on the machines. So there's several loopholes, but it's really difficult in pre-COVID times, especially for college students to vote. Next slide. And it's not just me that thinks that. The New York Times did a story about this in October of last year. Only Texas's turnout is worse. In Tennessee, voting is very, very difficult for the young. Next slide. We also have no motor voter law. When you go in to apply for a driver's license, you can check a box that says, would you like to register to vote? And if you check that box, you might think that your information is going straight to the Secretary of State's office and you are registered to vote. But that's not what it means. It means you'll get a paper application in the mail and then you can fill it out and send it in. There's no automatic transfer of this information. And we know where a lot of 16-year-olds are who get a driver's license, but we don't automatically register them when they turn 18. Next slide. Prior to COVID, we had something called no excuse, or we did not have no excuse absentee ballots, which means you had to meet a certain criteria in order to get an absentee ballot. You either had to be at home, out of your home, or you could be over 60, or you could be, for example, in the hospital, or you could be a caregiver that was not able to leave the person that they were caring for. Now, if you wanted to get an absentee ballot and you didn't meet that criteria, you might be able to get a doctor to write you a note. But in our state, it's a felony if the doctor signs a note to get you a ballot and you could go to the polling station but just didn't want to. We're going to have long lines and great health risks in our voting process this year in Tennessee, especially in November. We also have light tracking of absentee ballots. Did you know in some states you can track your ballot like you can track an Amazon package? You can see every step of the way, and at the end, you can see that your vote counted. And in our state, if you ask for an absentee ballot now under COVID and you get one, then you can only see when your ballot was sent to you and when it was received, but you don't know if your vote actually was cast. Next slide. So we also have one really good thing in Tennessee, and that is 14 days of early vote over a 3-week period. And my suggestion is that we all start treating early vote as if we actually had 15 election days, because it turns out we do. If we don't want to stand in long lines on election day, and I'll tell you, I love to vote on election day. It's like a holiday. But this year, everyone should be trying to either get an absentee ballot or vote early so that they don't get exposed to lines and COVID. Next slide. So there's some late developments happening right now in Tennessee in federal courts and our state Supreme Courts. So you might think, wow, I haven't heard about this. A lot of people haven't. Next slide. So the good news is, I mentioned it earlier, a judge says that we all get to vote absentee for any reason. We don't have to have an excuse for the August elections. And that is a great development. Next slide. But our Attorney General in our state, along with our Secretary of State, has actually filed an appeal. They want to stop absentee balloting in Tennessee, even during COVID. In fact, we know we can vote absentee in August, the election that's happening right now, but we still don't know if we can vote absentee in November. 90% of Americans are going to be able to vote absentee for sure in November, but we still don't know here in Tennessee. Next slide. So poorly was the Secretary of State administering the judge's order, and so few of our Tennessee counties actually had the information on their websites that the judge actually came back and threatened criminal penalties of our Secretary of State and said, shame on you for not informing the voters of their rights. Next slide. And Tennessee's opposition to COVID-19 absentee ballots actually was the subject of a U.S. Senate hearing just yesterday, where a U.S. Senator called our Secretary of State's explanation about fighting absentee ballots during COVID as pitiful, and it is. Next slide. And this story from the same hearing points out that our Secretary of State even said, we don't need absentee drop boxes. We don't need a place for people to be able to drop their ballots if they show up, if their absentee ballots show up late. And that's important because of the next slide. The United States Post Office is now saying that it's going to take 10 days each way for first-class mail. So we have an absentee ballot deadline later this month, but if you wait till the deadline, you are not going to get your ballot in time, or you're not going to be able to get that ballot back into the Election Commission on time. So I would even go so far as to say, if you haven't ordered an absentee ballot by today, I think it's too late. I would be nervous that it wouldn't get back in time and your vote might not count. Next slide. And if you do go and you request an absentee ballot and it doesn't come to you until very late and you know you can't mail it back in time, when you get to the, or even if they send you a ballot, or you've asked for a ballot and it hasn't even gotten to you, you could go into the voting polling place and you could give your name and they would let you vote provisionally. So you vote on a paper, on pieces of paper, and they put it in a great big bag and it has a lock on it and it looks very safe. But it turns out in Tennessee, only 23% of provisional ballots are even counted. Next slide. The Secretary of State's office is even warning candidates, political parties, and just citizens that if they link to the application for the website, on the website, the Secretary of State's website, if they link to the application for an absentee ballot, that it is a felony. You can link to their website, but you can't link to the absentee ballot application, which is really crazy. Next slide. And it turns out, because of the laws we have in Tennessee, nursing home residents are not going to be able to vote absentee at all this election. And this was a story that's hard to read here, but just from last week, some reporting from Joel Ebert from the Tennessean, is because of COVID, the registrars cannot go into the nursing homes to vote people. And in Tennessee, we only vote people in nursing homes. They cannot get absentee ballots. So if you're in a nursing home, you're going to be out of luck, or you can go to the polls and expose yourself maybe to crowds of people who might expose you to COVID. Next slide. So first-time voters in Tennessee also cannot get the absentee ballots because of a crazy law in Tennessee that says the first time you vote, you actually have to vote on the machines. And there's a workaround. You can go to your county election commission and you can show them your ID, and then you can get an absentee ballot. But there's a lot of people who are going to be requesting absentee ballots and are going to be very disappointed because they're brand new voters. They might be 18. They might have just moved to your county. They might be, newly naturalized citizens who are voting for the first time. And those people are going to have a very difficult time getting an absentee ballot. Next slide. So if you registered to vote for the first time, either because you turned 18 or this is your first election, you'll not have what's called an in-person designation. This was a story from the Tennessee Lookout last month. Next slide. Now in Nashville, because that's where I live, in Nashville, if you wanted to drive to the election commission to show them your ID, you would have to drive 13 miles from downtown Nashville or from wherever place you might live out to the election office. It's out by the airport. So it's not even a convenient location. So people would have cars and they have to be able to drive all the way out there during business hours to show their ID so that they'll have a right to have an absentee ballot. Next slide. And we get national attention for all the wrong reasons. This is a story that was in the Washington Post about how hard it's going to be for first-time voters to vote in Tennessee. Next slide. And this is not new. Consider what happened in 2018 in Memphis. And this is my good friend Charlene Oliver, who runs the equity units in Tennessee. Next slide. The Equity Alliance and the Black Voter Project registered 90,000 new African Americans to vote in the last election. And the election officials complained in Memphis that there were basically too many of them, that they didn't get them in far enough away from the deadline to be able to process them all. That's crazy. If there's a deadline, and if you meet the deadline, you should be able to be registered. They were also tossing out applications that weren't filled out completely. And to them, that included the salutation box, the one at the top that says like Mr., Ms., Miss. If that wasn't filled out, they were tossing those ballots. And a number of us came together, and there were lawsuits involved, and judges had to intervene to stop both practices. Next slide. And so you would think that maybe the legislature would say, and the Secretary of State, they would inform their election commissions, you really should work hard to make sure that all these registrations get processed. But no, they passed a law to punish voter registration groups with criminal fines and penalties. A federal judge had to step in, and finally, the legislature repealed the law just this past March. Next slide. So these are just headlines from around the country that are all about what's happening with voter suppression around the country. All of these stories involve Tennessee. Next slide. There's 2 court cases pending to determine under what conditions and whether we can vote absentee in November. We'll see what happens. Next slide. And we already know what can happen because there was a disaster in Georgia. Fulton County was the center of it. It has the largest population of Black voters, and lines were 7 hours long. Next slide. Here's an example of the long lines, which were called by election officials a catastrophe, especially in minority areas. Next slide, thank you. So I like to say, to quote the late Charlie Daniels song, the devil went down to Georgia, but there's no doubt there's moonlighting in Tennessee. Next slide. If you're still not convinced, let me tell you about a plan that the Republicans have in place for November. It's very well funded. Next slide. This headline is about the $20 million and 50,000 people that they've hired to go to polling places to challenge people that maybe they don't belong at that polling place. Maybe they have a name that is Garcia. Maybe they're wearing a hijab. Maybe somebody doesn't think that that voter lives in that part of town. This is what we can expect in November. Next slide. I put this in for some laughs. This is Jose Andres, the celebrity chef, and he shows up at disasters all over the world. And he's planning on setting up food and water stations for voters on election day. It's that bad. Next slide. And it's not just progressives who are saying this. The conservative Washington Post columnist George Will just last week quoted a scholar at the conservative Hoover Institution who said, next slide, the hard truth is that there's a rising tide of voter suppression in US elections. These actions have the appearance of enforcing abstract principles of electoral integrity, but the clear effect and apparent intent of disproportionately disenfranchising racial minorities. Next slide. So what gives me hope? We all need a little hope. Remember those long lines in Georgia? 3 times as many people showed up to vote in Georgia as voted in the last presidential election year. Next slide. And I believe Tennesseans are going to vote no matter what, but they have to have the information that they need. Next slide. So what do? We vote early. We remember we have 14 days of early vote. We're in day 6 right now of early vote, so there's still plenty of time. Next slide. And just to give you an idea, when President Obama was elected in 2008, just if you looked at the Nashville vote, 72% of the Nashville vote was cast during early vote, which is really great. And it's never been that good before. And we're hoping it gets to be 80% or higher this election year. Next slide. So we need to get 80% of the voters to the polls. hopefully, even if you have great traditions about going on election day, or even if you sort of don't trust absentee ballots, you got to figure out a way to get your vote to count. And I'm hoping that you might consider early vote as a way to do that. Next slide. And you should vote for legislators who vote to make it easier for citizens to vote. And that would include Andrea, who's just a champion on these issues. And you should support organizations that are dedicated to advancing our voting rights and our democracy. My particular favorite is the Equity Alliance. And finally, this just the inspirational quote from the late Representative John Lewis. It's been a very tough week for us in Washington and all over the country. But he always says, do not get lost in the sea of despair. Be hopeful and be optimistic. So some of my presentation isn't so optimistic, but I'm hoping that armed with information and as we answer questions as we go through the rest of this session, is that you'll feel empowered to be able to go vote and also teach your friends, your neighbors, and your family so that they'll know what to do too.
Wow. Lisa, oh my goodness, we have work to do. We have so much work to do. And I'm going to start us off as in the words of Chris Cuomo, let's get after it, okay? So in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Now, can you describe what that case was about and the impact the Supreme Court's decision has or had on voting in general and on the African American and minority voting in particular?
Yes, I will. In 2013, the Supreme Court in a case, in the Shelby County case, and it was not Shelby County, Tennessee, it was Shelby County, Alabama, ruled that no longer were jurisdictions required to pre-clear changes in their elections. So what does that mean? It means that there were counties and whole states in our country for decades that discriminated against people of color, usually Black people in the South, and it was Spanish-speaking people in the West. And in both places, it wasn't just the South, but there were counties in California, for example, that were under the pre-clearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act. So that meant if you wanted to move a polling place from one school down the street to another school, you had to submit that request to the United States Department of Justice. And they were the only ones who could tell you, local jurisdiction, yes, you can move your polling place. Because any change that was made was seen as a threat to the Black vote or to the vote of people who didn't speak our language or speak the English language. So in 2013, the Supreme Court said, basically, we're done. We had a Black president and there's no more discrimination. And so we don't need all these changes that elections want to make, that local elections officials want to make. We don't have to have those come to the DOJ. You all can work it out yourself. So in Congress right now, we have H.R. 4, which is the Voting Rights Act, the new Voting Rights Act that would reverse the Supreme Court decision. And the Terry Sewell is the co-sponsor from Alabama, Congressman Terry Sewell from Selma, and she is proposing, and it will be unanimously supported, that we rename H.R. 4 to be the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in honor of him and his life's work.
Right, and all the work that he's done, and I know Representative Terry Sewell, and I think she says how touched she is that he would always recognize her because she represents Selma, and I thought that was so sweet. So where does the U.S. rank in voter participation compared to other countries?
Well, other countries have different systems. In fact, some countries have compulsory voting. You have to vote or else they fine you on your taxes. You can go and vote for nobody if you want, but you have to go and have the active voting or else you have to pay a fine. So it's hard to compare with other countries because they have just totally different systems. What's easy to compare is state to state in the United States. And the biggest problem really, and some don't see it as a problem, and I see that point of view, is that we don't have a national election. So some countries like Brazil, who won, all over the country that very night because they have a national election. We actually don't have 50 elections. We have thousands of elections because our elections are carried out by each individual county. So it means that it's hard to hack the whole country, right? I mean, there's also some concern about foreign influence in our elections. So that sort of goes away if you're having individual counties carry out their elections. But we are terrible compared to other states. We're the third hardest state to vote and among the worst in terms of participation. But I always say, like, that's not our fault. Like, people want to vote, but the laws are in place that make it so hard that you have to like jump through hoops over and over again and like really keep up with the changing rules. If people wanted folks to vote, it would be easier to vote.
Exactly. Okay. So what states do you think do the best job in making it easy for voters to vote?
Easy. That question is easy. Colorado and Oregon, for example, make it really easy to vote, and Washington State. So let me tell you why. In those three states, everything is mail-in voting. They don't even have polling places anymore.
Wow.
You don't have to ask for a ballot. Your ballot is just sent to you in the mail. And so people can take that absentee ballot, they can fill it out at the kitchen table, they can study the issues, they can talk to their family members if they want their advice. They literally don't even have a place to go anymore to, worry about machines that might not be working. Everything is by mail. And participation in Washington State is about 80% of their registered voters. In our state, it's only half of our registered voters.
I mean, that is just so disturbing to think about what Tennessee is doing. So most of us are familiar with voter suppression in the early part of the 20th century through the 60s and the Jim Crow laws relating to poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. Now, voter suppression has grown more sophisticated. So what are some examples of the 21st century voter suppression?
Well, one of the biggest examples right now in this era of COVID, when a judge has said Tennesseans are going to be able to all get an absentee ballot to keep themselves safe. We find out about these classes of people that aren't actually going to be able to get an absentee ballot. So I mentioned folks in nursing homes, for example. They're not going to be able to get absentee ballots. And people who are voting for the very first time in your county. If you move from one county to another county, you have to re-register, and that counts as a first-time voter in that county. So even though you voted in Tennessee before, you're still going to have to show your ID to elections officials before the election. Take your ID out there and say, I want to be able to show my ID so that you can mark me as who I say I am, so that I can get an absentee ballot. And part of this is just like, that's really hard for a lot of people to do. As you saw on the map, you got to drive all the way to the airport in Nashville to get that done. But also people just don't know the information. So you might request an absentee ballot and then you sit and you wait for it, but it never comes. Well, they're not obligated to tell you that they're not sending you a ballot. And meanwhile, you think you're going to if I just wait one more day, I might get that ballot. It turns out you're never getting that ballot, because you got to vote on the machines the first time, or you have to go to the elections office and show them your ID. And the Secretary of State doesn't publicize this well. So you're left to sort of like figure it out on your own.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned about the nursing homes earlier.
Yeah.
So what must one do that's in a senior assisted living facility or nursing home? They can't vote absentee. So how will they be allowed to vote this time?
So this is in Tennessee law, that they will not send absentee ballots to nursing homes. And I was thinking about this and sort of like asking some questions like, why is that? And it turns out that that the officials in our state and the Secretary of State's office believe that if you're in a nursing home, you might be able to be taken advantage of through your ballot. That somebody that works there, for example, might take your ballot and vote the way that they want you to, or that a family member would vote on your behalf. And so what the election commissions do is go into the nursing homes and vote people in the nursing homes. So what happens in COVID? We know that a lot of our nursing homes right now are on lockdown.
That's right.
So nobody can go, family members can't go. And so the election officials aren't going to be going there to vote them. And the only people who can get it is if you are, I know this sounds crazy, like this woman must be making this up. I promise you I'm not. If you're in a nursing home in one county, but you're registered to vote in another county, then you can get an absentee ballot, but you have to check the I'm over 60 box, and then you can get it. It is so infuriating. It is so infuriating. If anybody that's on this session has somebody in a nursing home that is going to want to vote, reach out. I'm happy to help you figure this out. Some counties are figuring out how to get their nursing home residents voted because they don't have the crisis level of COVID yet. But we know that most of our counties have prohibited people from visiting the nursing homes.
Okay, so we have, like I said, work to do. And it seems like the main reason lawmakers give for passing laws that make it harder to register voters and for people to vote is to prevent voter fraud. But there's little to no evidence of any widespread voter fraud, either in person or by mail. There's a report the White House prepared that looked at voter fraud over the last 15 years. And in Tennessee, they found a total of 6 cases over 15 years. So around one incident every other year. And none of them had anything to do with absentee ballots. So how can we do a better job of pointing out that their claims of widespread voter fraud are probably false? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And if I knew the answer to that, I guess, we would figure out also how to convince them of other things. Some of the other, crazy things that are going on in our country aren't true. You're exactly right, Andrea. There are so few cases of voter fraud. And let me tell you about a good example in Nashville in 2018, I guess. We had a lot of elections going on in 2018. We voted, I think, 5 times in Davidson County. It was really hard to keep up with all the times we were voting. And I have a friend of mine who's in her early 50s, and she went to vote early. And there was another election, happening 3 weeks later. And she got confused about the dates. And so she went to try to go vote again in the same election. She knew there were 2 coming up. And there were like 2 weeks separating the time she went one time and went the second time. But it turned out that was the same election. And so they just nicely told her, like, hey, you've already voted in this election. But she left and she called me and she's like, I'm so glad they told me. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. But I wonder if those are some of the cases that they're finding is people trying to vote, a second time. I mean, that's silly. There's a way to solve that. You just say, hey, you know what? You already came here right at the beginning of early vote. Now we're at the end of early vote. Come back when we're voting next time. So yeah, there've been, I think there was, as you say, 6 examples over 15 years, and so all of this infrastructure is put into place to protect us from like the 6 people who voted incorrectly. I mean, either they used somebody else's ID or maybe they voted on the machines and they also tried to vote absentee. I don't know, but 6 cases. My goodness.
I mean, it's disturbing. So 34 states and the District of Columbia all allow no excuse absentee ballots. Meaning anyone can opt to vote by mail for any reason. In 5 states, like you said, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington conduct their elections entirely by mail. So voters in these states do not need to request a ballot. They automatically receive one. Wouldn't it be great if Tennessee would one day be that way? But Tennessee is one of the few remaining states that does not allow no excuse absentee ballots. However, earlier this summer, Chancellor Lyle ruled that Tennessee must allow voters concerned about COVID to vote absentee. But on Wednesday, Tennessee's Secretary of State testified before the U.S. Senate committee and made clear that the state is appealing Chancellor Lyle's ruling to the Tennessee Supreme Court in hopes to prevail. So, how might that affect absentee voting in the general election?
So it's such a great question, and we don't really know. Okay. Right now, Judge Lyle's ruling holds. So we have an election going on. Anybody can vote absentee that wants to get an absentee ballot. If this Tennessee State Supreme Court steps in and says, no, 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 we are going to overrule Judge Lyle and we're going to side with our Secretary of State and our State Attorney General, then that means we can't vote absentee in November. But if they don't step in, then Judge Lyle's ruling would continue through the November election. So I don't know what the answer is yet. What I think is going to happen, at least on the ground, is, let me give you an example. And this, I know the Nashville stuff a little bit better than I know statewide, but let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. In the last presidential election year, in the August primary, which is what we're in now, so they're kind of equivalent, right? Mm-hmm. In Nashville, there were 600 absentee ballots that were cast. So 600 is, not that many. Yeah. On Monday, when early votes started in Davidson County, the county also announced the number of absentee ballots that were already in, and that was on the first day of early vote. There were already 10,000 absentee ballots that were already in on the first day of early vote. And every day they get more and more. And so I think people are going to love voting absentee. Yes. And they're going to say, why can't we do that again? Right. And the Supreme Court says, no, 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 you can't do it again. I think people are going to be pretty upset. Mm-hmm. And clearly we're not going to be done with COVID by then, right? Because our state is a number about 11th, in worst states right now dealing with COVID cases.
And you mentioned something about tracking your vote, and I love that because that was a question that we all had. So we have many that have already voted absentee, and they tracked it as far as they could take it. They saw where it was received in the election commission's office, but we don't know if that vote is going to count. It just says it was received. So still there's a possibility that something could happen. My mom, she did absentee voting, and in Haywood County, you have to, in all of them for the absentee ballot, you have to make sure you circle in the entire thing, right? You can't just put an X in the box.
Right, right.
My mom had put X's at first, and she said, check this. I think I maybe have to fill this all the way in. And that's exactly what the direction said. So my fear is if someone just thinks they can check it, they may just go through very innocently checking off who they choose. Will that count? Do you know if that will count, or would they throw that out?
So it depends county by county. What some counties will say is we give the we try to determine the voter's intent.
Okay.
And so if they see a check or an X, they very well may in that county say that's fine. But here's where you can get hung up. You have to sign it. You have to sign the ballot because they have to match the signature on your ballot and the signature that they have on file. And so some people might fail to sign their ballot, and then it wouldn't count. Then it would be discarded. And the problem that I have with this part of the process is that it would be okay. I mean, you would be disappointed if your vote didn't count, but wouldn't it be good to know that your vote didn't count, because then you could pursue it. I wonder why my vote didn't count. And maybe they would say, well, you hadn't signed it, or, well, you actually aren't registered in our county anymore, or something, right? But you don't know. And in some states, every step of the way. When you applied for an absentee ballot, when it was issued by the election commission, when it arrived at the post office, when it was on the delivery truck, just like Amazon.
Exactly.
You can practically just, exactly where your stuff is, right? And it would be also great then to know, oh yes, it reached the election commission, and oh, I see that my vote was counted. And that would be that the technology is there. It's just that we don't use that technology in Tennessee.
But how reassuring if we could have something like that. And I'm going to be hopeful that one day we will do that. We have to have the right people in office to make that change. Now, I'm getting some questions about purging voters. There were a lot of issues with people showing up to vote, and they said, "No, I'm sorry, but you're not registered here," or their names were purged from the roll. Can you tell us about purging and how we need to make sure that we're okay?
Yes. So I would recommend that everybody go to govotetn.org. I think it's org, not gov. Govotetn.org.
Okay.
And you can do something called check your status. This is the Secretary of State's website that can allow you to look up your voter status.
Okay.
And when you check your status, you have to put in your first name, your last name, your date of birth, and the last four numbers of your social security number.
Mm-hmm.
And then it'll pop up and it'll show you that you are registered. And it'll also show you where your polling place is. It'll show you, that's where it'll show you that your ballot has been issued if you ask for an absentee ballot. And that's the same place that it'll show that it's been received back to the Election Commission. If you do go and they say, hey, you're not, on the list, you may have been purged, because Tennessee for many years had a very aggressive purging operation. And that meant that if you didn't vote in 2 federal elections,
okay,
and then you were on kind of a watch list, like, oh, these people may have been tired of voting. They may not want to vote anymore. And then if the 3rd federal election came around and you still didn't show up, then you were off the rolls. Now, I think that's just wrong, because unless you died or unless you moved away, you just may have been busy or cranky for all the years. We want everybody to vote every time, but you just may have not been inspired, right?
Exactly.
But if you still live in that same place and you've still registered and you haven't keeled over, you should march in and be able to vote. And so they do purging of people who do die, people that move, and they've got to clean their lists up from time to time. But they shouldn't be purging people who just haven't been participating as often as we would like.
Now, do other states do that? Do you know if other states do that, or is Tennessee famous for that only?
So Tennessee is aggressive at it. And in fact, I kind of went back and talked to some people that used to work, for the previous Secretary of State who worked in the, previous regime when the Democrats were in charge. And I said, tell me about your purging program. And he's like, what do you mean? Well, did you aggressively purge people that didn't vote? And he said, no, not at all. We got the death notices and then we matched them up and that was it, Yeah. So I think this has been a new initiative in the last decade.
Okay, so if you could pick 3 laws or policies you'd like to see the legislature pass to make it easier to vote in Tennessee, what would they be?
Well, my top 3 would be no excuse absentee voting, and not just during COVID, right? We should be able to get absentee ballots anytime we want to.
Okay.
I would also eliminate 30-day voter registration. If you are new to our state and you arrive 2 weeks before Election Day, you can't vote in our state. You are essentially disenfranchised from picking your senator, your president, et cetera. You should be able to register to vote on Election Day, showing the proper identification that shows that you reside in our state. And then with college students, I would really change the whole way that we vote college students. And I would make it easier for them, and I would put an early voting location on college campuses. There's not a single early voting location on a single Tennessee college or university. And in many parts of our state, like the college community, there's a lot of people there, right? So there's no reason that there shouldn't be a polling place there. But I think the intent is that you're really not interested in having students vote.
Gosh, well, we have so much work to do. I hope tonight people are listening and we have been encouraged by information that we've heard. And Lisa, we just appreciate you so much. Is there anything else, Lisa? I'm trying to see if we have any questions out there before we probably put, I believe, I want to make sure. I think we've gone through the questions that I saw pop up. So listen, Lisa, I can't thank you enough for sharing your time, your knowledge with us tonight. And I think we all learned what we're up against and how important it is to keep fighting the barriers that prevent people from exercising the right to vote. I'd like to end tonight with another quote from our belated Congressman John Lewis. The vote is precious. It's almost sacred. So go out and vote like you've never voted before. This year, in light of all that is happening in our nation and in our state, and in honor of his legacy, I hope we will all heed to Congressman Lewis's words and vote. And for those of you in Crockett, Haywood, and Lauderdale counties, I hope you will cast your vote for me. Please visit my website at www.andreabondjohnsonTN82.com. Remember, please, to be safe, wash your hands, practice social distancing, and remember to mask up. Lisa, thank you once again, and we will call it an evening. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye bye.